want to come up here? Because that camera's going to be...
Slå ner vad ni vill. Det är så mycket teknikgrejer så det dröjer innan de kommer på plats alla här. Nej, det är både vårt Visby och deras. De flyttar runt sig här och sådär. Jag sa ju det för ja. Jaha. Okej, men...
I'm all ready. Thank you. Thank you. Which one are you sitting in? I can't remember whether you want to sit there or there. Okay. Oh, no, don't care about that. No, no. If you want to sit there, sit there. Oh, okay. Should we just sit up there? Okay. Oh, did you ask Kaija if he wants our stuff out of there by... Ah, okay. Oh, do you want to print out 3 sign-up sheets? Oh, this is from you? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that... I bet you could. Okay.
So, we will have to end at 4:30.
Perfect.
So, technique, hello, yeah. So, welcome to this seminar, The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance and Hope, where we all will have the opportunity to listen to Amy Goodman. Welcome, most welcome.
Thank you.
And we will listen to you, and this time you will not primarily ask the questions, but I will have the opportunity to do that.
That's what you think.
That's what I think. Okay. And I would like us for this seminar to elaborate a bit on the silenced majority, but also on the experience that you've had here in Almedalen. But First, for those of you who doesn't really know Amy Goodman, she started the news program Democracy Now! In the mid-90s, and it's now the largest public media collaboration in the US and available to people seeking alternative viewpoints around the globe. And Democracy Now! Focuses on issues that you consider to be underreported or ignored by mainstream news coverage. And I would also like to mention that Amy Goodman received the Right Livelihood Award in 2008. And the motivation that they gave is the following: for developing an innovative model of truly independent political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded by mainstream media. And they also say that you want to give voice to the voiceless. So, how do you give voice to the voiceless?
Well, first, it's a great honor to be here, and thank you so much to everyone for coming. And I hope you all turn off your NSA tracking devices. Isn't it amazing that we actually pay instead of being paid to be tracked? So I just thought I would make that point. Well, Democracy Now! Started 18 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. So it's very interesting to be here. This feels like something you wear as a kid, like for braces. Excuse me. I've never worn something like this before. It's very interesting to be here in this week-long celebration of democracy. I mean, Almedalen is very interesting. I assume for Swedes, but very interesting for us outside of Sweden. We have these conventions that are so rancorous, the Democrats, the Republicans. It's unusual because on the one hand, there's this huge gridlock in Washington, and it seems like they don't get along at all. But actually, fundamentally, they agree on many, many critical issues. And here you have this gathering that's like a convention, but everyone, all of the parties are represented. And that's very interesting for us. We started 18 years ago. I was actually in Haiti when I got the call whether I wanted to be the host of this show. And I was covering people who were risking their lives. I was in a safe house, risking their lives to go to the polls and vote. In the United States, people don't face anything like that risk to vote. I covered East Timor. People died when they voted. In the United States, there wasn't that kind of risk, and most people didn't even bother voting. Why would I devote all of my efforts to an election show? But I actually thought maybe this is much more interesting than it seems, because we would go from state to state, and I didn't think people were apathetic. I thought maybe people felt they weren't really being given a choice, so why bother? That the corporations captured both parties. What difference does one person's vote make when corporations are treated as people in the United States? So we went from state to state. People were very engaged at the local level. And so when the election came and went and the show was supposed to shut down, Democracy Now!, there was more demand for it than before. We broadcast on 8 community stations in 1996 when we started. Now we're broadcasting on over 1,200 public radio and television stations in the United States and around the world. We broadcast every day in Sweden in 3 cities. In Stockholm, you know, on the open channel every night at 11 and then repeated in the morning, as well as in, if I'm pronouncing it right, Gothenburg and another city as well. What is that? Ba. You heard it. Yes, all 3 cities. So I was was amazed just today as people come up and say hi because they watch the broadcast. And a famous journalist here, because he was held in Ethiopian jails for, 438 days, Martin, yes, he came over to me here, and I said, how would you recognize me? He said, are you kidding? I watch you on the Open Channel. And I want to make a point about that. The Open Channel in Sweden is like public access in the United States. We shouldn't take people's channels for granted. They're in every city in the United States. They're a way people have access to the airwaves. They're often underfunded, and and in our case, the telecoms that run them don't give them the right kind of support, and so they sound and look bad. But we have to build a people's media throughout the United States and all over the world, because the problem in the United States is the corporate media. It is such a small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. It is the media beating the drums for war. So I'll give you the example of Iraq in 2003, and I'd really like to hear from you as well and the kind of coverage that you get and you would like to see. In the United States, the U.S. is deciding whether to go to war. They're building this case, the Bush administration, of weapons of mass destruction. The media is not supposed to be a part of the parties. It's supposed to be apart from the parties. You know, we have a job to do. We are supposed to cover power, not cover for power. We're supposed to be the fourth estate, not for the state. And we're supposed to cover the movements that create static and make history. So, leading up to the war in Iraq, millions of people all over the globe are rocking the planet for peace, right? Millions of people. In the United States, that gets a picture in the newspaper. But who gets interviewed? The generals. It sort of redefines general news. The generals get interviewed. And the opinion, the range of opinion is often, do we bomb by air or should it be boots on the ground? Right? And that's where the Democrats and Republicans might fight it out. You know, one side saying, no troops there, other one saying, just let it be an air war. Where are the people who believe this is not the answer? And we are not talking about a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate, which is why we have to take it back.
But Amy, what role of the media would you like to see?
The media should be a platform for people to speak for themselves. There is nothing more powerful than that. I originally come from a network in the United States called Pacifica Radio, which was founded by a war resister in World War II, who said, when he came out of the detention camps, because war resistors were often conscientious objectors jailed during the war. When he came out of the detention camps, he said, there's got to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. That's how our network, Pacifica, was born. Not run by corporations, as one dean of a journalism school said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And that's how all was born. It is 5 radio stations in the United States: New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, and Texas. And let me give you an example of the Texas station in Houston, what we call the Petro Metro, right? That's Houston, Texas, oil city, Petro Metro. So it goes on the air in 1970, KPFT. Within a few weeks, the Ku Klux Klan, and it was interesting to go to the anti-racist rally here where hundreds of people, were any of you there today, were protesting the party that was speaking, the Party of Swedes, that was just down the road. Hundreds of, especially young people, were there, and some older people also. But you know what the Ku Klux Klan is in the United States, the KKK, white supremacist organization. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter of the radio station, and they blew it to smithereens. When KPFT got back on their feet a few months later and they rebuilt their transmitter, it was right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing, Woody Guthrie's son, singing Alice's Restaurant. They blew it up again. Why? Why would you bother blowing up a radio station? It's the only radio station in the United States that was blown up. Well, I think it's because independent media is dangerous to hate groups. Independent media provides a forum for people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an Iraqi uncle or an aunt in Afghanistan, it's down barriers because it breaks down caricatures and stereotypes. I'm not saying that you would agree with what you hear. How often do we agree with our family members? But you begin to understand where they're coming from. And that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is so often wielded as a weapon of war. I go back to World War II. There's this interesting story. We were just broadcasting from Japan, and I went to Hiroshima. In the United States, the Secretary of War at the time was named Henry Stimson. And when he was handed the bombing list of countries to bomb in Japan to drop the atomic bomb on, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto was on the list. And he's given the list, and they say choose 2 cities because they've got 2 kinds of bombs. He crosses off Kyoto. Why? Because he and Mrs. Stimson had visited Kyoto. The food delicious, the people lovely, the temples were beautiful. He didn't want to destroy Kyoto. He knew this city. If only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were so lucky to have hosted the Stimsons. But that's such a powerful metaphor for the power of the media. The media is the place we come to know each other. I mean, if you don't come from another place or know a family member or friend from somewhere else, how do you learn about it? You learn about it in the media. That's why it's so important. It's not just another institution. It is critical that we learn about each other through something other than a corporate lens or a corporate microphone. And for national security in the United States, it's critical that the rest of the world learn about us through an independent lens. That's why independent media is so important.
And I know that it's very important for you to try to support peace and to build bridges, like you say. But then when I read things that you've been writing and when I listen to you, you also speak about justice in many ways. So how do you think you can contribute to justice through the role that you are playing through media?
Well, peace isn't simply the lack of war. It is much more difficult, I think, to wage peace than to wage war. Because peace is also about equality, about justice, about people feeling respected. And I think we begin by having conversations. I mean, just using a microphone and going like this is not just a way to ensure that, the sound is good on both sides. When we put the microphone out there, it is a sign of respect. I want to hear what you have to say, how you frame it. I see the media as this sacred place. It's our job to go to where the silence is, to have people tell their own stories, or if they can't, to tell their stories until they can tell their own.
That's a beautiful mission. These 2 days now that you've been visiting Almedalen, how do you view the democratic value of this?
I am amazed by what is happening here, seeing all of this discussion taking place. We did 2 days of broadcasts. Yesterday we interviewed the Archbishop of the Church of Sweden, and that was fascinating. And I said, you know, how long did this take, the first woman Archbishop of the Church of Sweden? She said, 850 years. So I was just texting someone and I said, so there is hope. It just, you know, when your friends or family members get upset, you know, you just say, you know, give it time. As she did. But just to speak with the Archbishop, this passionate voice on the issue of climate change, among other issues. Climate change. Democracy Now, we go to every single UN climate summit since Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, Doha. We went to the People's Summit in Bolivia. We went to, this past year was in Warsaw, Poland. And you might say, why waste the fuel? What gets accomplished at these UN summits? Why would you bother? Well, they are astounding, much more for what happens outside. Thousands of people come from around the globe, especially people from the most endangered countries, the small island nations, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa suffering from the desertification of their continent. We in the United States suffer every day. You wouldn't know it if you were an American watching television. You tune in for the weather most often. What should I wear? But what about what should we do about it? Because often the meteorologists on television are climate deniers, climate change deniers, believe it or not. And I'm not just talking about Fox, I'm talking about on CNN. It's an astounding story. You know, we call it a lower third in our tech jargon of television. It's that thing at the bottom of the screen that flashes things, sometimes describes what people are talking about. It'll say extreme weather. It'll say severe weather. And then, you know, you pay more attention, and then they've got you glued, so they go to a commercial for a pharmaceutical company for weapons that you might want to buy. And then you come back, okay, and then we're going to tell you the temperature in a minute. What about other two words? Climate change, global warming, or global climate disruption. Because when we make that connection, you've made it here. And when we talk to people at these climate summits and travel the world, everyone's made the connection. There's a scientific consensus on the issue of climate change, except in the United States. It's amazing. Here you have debates, and certainly at the climate summits, about what are we going to do about it. And those are valid debates. What is the best approach? Do you divest from the oil industry? What is the best approach in dealing with alternative energy? Very important debates. How much do you live off of the grid? All of those things. In the United States, the debate, are human beings involved in climate change? It is like every time you talk about the planet, having on someone from the Flat Earth Society to have a debate. Is the Earth's flat or is it round? That's what it's like in the United States. Why? Because people are stupid? No. Because money is so pervasive in politics in the United States that the oil, the gas, the coal companies, they set up these, you know what, you have them too, think tanks, right? In the United States, these particular ones are called stink tanks. And they are false think tanks that are fueled by, that are funded by the oil industry. They know they can't just deny that climate change exists, so they just obfuscate it. You know, do we really know? It's like 20 years ago, the tobacco companies saying, can you prove that you have cancer because you smoked a cigarette? Well, I might not be able to prove it in one case, but we know epidemiologically, and the tobacco companies were the first to know that they were causing cancer. So that's where we are in the climate change debate, is they just say, can you absolutely connect this superstorm in New York with this oil plant in Ohio? And that's where the debate is diverted.
But Amy, you also speak about the politics of climate apartheid. Could you say something about that?
Well, this is critical, is who suffers and who doesn't. You know, the Pentagon knows very well. They have put out quiet reports about wars over climate change in the 21st century being the greatest threat to national security. We're talking about, for example, climate refugees, people leaving one country to go to another because their climate is so radically changing, people fighting for lasting. These are very serious issues. And when you have the most powerful countries on earth, like my own, like the United States, that is responsible for the vast majority of the carbon pollution, what are developing countries to do? They are not causing climate change, but they have to deal with the brunt of it. And that issue of justice is one that has to be raised over and over again. You know, for example, it's the issue of war as well. Very quickly on Iraq. In 2003, I was about to say this before, there was the study done of the 4 major nightly newscasts right before the U.S. invaded Iraq. And they looked at how many times they had on peace leaders. The country was divided, half and half, around going to war with Iraq. In the 2 weeks around then Secretary of State Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UN, February 5th, 2003, there were 393 interviews done around war in 2 weeks. Half the population for and against. So that would be what, 160, 170 voices for, against? No. How many voices were with anti-war leaders? 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That is an extreme media beating the drums for war. And we have to challenge that, whether it comes to climate change, whether it comes to the growing inequality between rich and poor, whether it has to do with war and peace. Because most people, I really do believe, are deeply concerned about the fate of the planet.
So where do you see hope in this? As you speak about the silenced majority, and you speak about these things on war, on justice, but where is hope in this for you?
The hope is people all over the world who also deeply care, and I think that's the vast majority. Whether I'm covering, I don't know how many of you know of East Timor, this tiny island nation 300 miles above Australia that was occupied by Indonesia for a quarter of a century, one of the great genocides of the late 20th century. A third of the population was killed off. When I went to cover Timor in 1990 and 91, I mean, people would take me to a backyard and dig up in their backyard a piece of paper that was a non-binding, an article about a non-binding resolution in the United States Congress that no American knew about, that talked about whether weapons should go to Indonesia because they were killing the people of Timor. And they would hold it up and say, see, we are making progress. And I would think, oh my gosh, if only. But they won at an unacceptably high price. A third of their population killed, 200,000 people, but they by the way, I want to just say something quickly on Timor and Indonesia that's very relevant. 1 minute ago I got a text about this from within Indonesia. There are 2 leading candidates who are running for president. One man named Jokowi, the current governor of Jakarta, and the other is Prabowo, the son-in-law, former son-in-law of the long-reigning late dictator Suharto. And Prabowo was responsible for a number of massacres in East Timor and terrible massacres in Indonesia proper. And he has surged in the polls recently. My colleague, who I went to East Timor with in 1990 and 91, we survived a massacre that we witnessed and were covering when the Indonesian military, holding U.S. weapons, opened fire on a crowd of defenseless Timorese, gunning down over 250 Timorese. They beat my colleague Alan Nairn's skull until they fractured it, put us before a firing squad, but we survived, I think because we were from the weapons their country was from, that we were from the country their weapons were from. They were price for killing us that they'd never had to pay for killing the Timorese. Alan is in Indonesia right now, and he did an interview with Prabowo years after the massacre. The people of East Timor ultimately got their freedom, and they're one of the newest nations in the world, by the way. An astounding event in 2002. But Alan did an interview with Prabowo years ago, but when he had fell out of favor in Indonesia and he was willing to talk. And he said he wanted to have the bravery to be a fascist dictator. Now he is running for president, and Alan has released this interview, and it has caused a firestorm in Indonesia. Because the people of Indonesia, like the people of Sweden, like the people of Timor, the United States, like the people throughout Latin America, do not want a fascist dictator. And this is now brewing. It's the front page of every newspaper. And this is also why independent media is so important, to tell the truth, to speak to people, to delve deep. It's not just a he said, she said situation. It's finding out the truth of the matter. And we need something that challenges those in power. In the United States, there's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. And we take that very seriously.
I think we should open up for the audience to ask questions. So, do we have more microphones here? Is there anyone who knows? Or I'll go around them.
Oscar.
And you can say who you are.
Yeah, my name is Oscar Sjöstedt, and I study international relations at Stockholms University. I just wonder if you can talk a little about how the Occupy Wall Street movement was portrayed in the U.S. corporate media, and maybe also Democracy's Now role in the struggle for Occupy Wall Street.
Very important question. And it's the question about how the media covers popular uprisings anywhere. Let's just look at that remarkable year of 2011. So what happened at the beginning? Well, it was Egypt. At the beginning of 2011, our senior producer, Sharif Abdel-Quddus, and how many of you, by the way, watch or listen to or read Democracy Now? I hope you tell all your friends. I think Dennis is passing around a sign-up sheet. You can sign up for our daily... Oh, great. Kaisha is doing that. Sign up for our daily digest. You can get our news alerts. It links you to all the stories, and of course you can watch on your open channels. But democracynow.org should be your destination. So especially in covering these kinds of issues. So Sharif, our senior producer, was in the United States for 8 years with us, and he's Egyptian American. He flies home because the Egyptian revolution is taking place. He never left Tahrir. And he was there with our videographer, also Egyptian American, Hani Massoud, who almost played on the Egyptian national basketball team, leaps tall buildings in a single bound, and that's very, very important when you're covering dangerous situations to have someone like that at your side. So there he was with his camera and Sharif in the streets, and we were getting coverage of Egypt like no network could give. Sharif stayed in Tahrir, and he was interviewing everyone to give you a sense, not just that bird's eye view, very impressive image of 1 million people in Tahrir, that was important. But I don't know if you remember what happened. First, Mubarak brought down the internet, right? And as Sharif joked, that was his worst mistake, Mubarak's. He said, because after all, we're Egyptian, we would have been at home on Facebook. But he brings down the internet, so we have to go outside and see what's happening. And thus we have Tahrir, only kidding. But so he brings down the internet. Then the internet goes back up, but the thugs break up the satellites. That's what the networks used. You know, we started in such a scrappy, basic way at Democracy Now! That we had no money for those satellites. You know, the networks paid millions to Saddam Hussein to use the satellites. It's a story that isn't told very much. Well, we didn't have that ability. You know, Jeremy Scahill's work. Jeremy did Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and Dirty Wars. He started as a producer at Democracy Now! He was nominated for an Oscar this year for his film on Dirty Wars about U.S. drone strikes and the Joint Special Operations Command, the special forces in places like Somalia and Pakistan, the drone strikes, the U.S. killing citizens all over the world, but not just U.S. citizens, and what that means. Should the U.S. population have a say in what is done in our name? So Jeremy goes to Iraq, and there's this big firewall Saddam has put up, you know, to prevent the kind of video going out that we would put out. And but we perfected a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet. And when they couldn't, when the firewall was up, they go into internet cafes and they'd send a beautiful video report in like 150 emails through a special program where we would piece it back together in New York, and we would show these stories. In Egypt, when the satellites were brought down, the networks, they showed Anderson Cooper from CNN from his hotel room in the lower third would say, reporting from an undisclosed location. There is Sharif in the middle of Tahrir, and he is saying his name, he is saying where he is, and he says, this is the safest place to be in Egypt right now. When the internet was brought down, he got around that firewall, and he became one of the most followed and tweeted tweeters in the world, talking about what was happening in Egypt. When the satellites went down, we now use satellites, but we also know how to send through the internet, and he would be interviewing people in Tahrir like Adef Suef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, and Nawal Saadawi, at the time she was 79-year-old. She was a psychiatrist, very famous writer. She had been exiled and imprisoned under Sadat and Mubarak. She had run for president. He was interviewing the young high school students who were putting out a broadsheet in the shadow of the state media building, Voices of Tahrir, challenging the lies that the state media had put out for decades. You were getting a cross-section of Egyptian society. And Hani would then take the video that he did of these interviews. As Sharif would stay there, he would run back home, put it together, send it through the internet. And when the networks were saying, we can't broadcast, you'd see them on kind of like Skype, like Anderson Cooper. That was like old democracy. Now we had these beautiful 25-minute pieces that showed that cross-section of society. That's Egypt. Then Wisconsin happens in the United States, this uprising because there's an attack on labor rights. 150,000 people marching in freezing Swedish-type weather, marching for justice. And then the summer happens, and there's the Keystone XL pipeline bringing the Alberta oil, the Alberta dirty tar sands oil down to the United States. Obama's deciding whether this should actually happen. 1,200 people get arrested in front of the White House. And then the question of Occupy. That was the end of August, beginning of September. And people then go to New York, and there are many people in New York, and thousands march on Zuccotti Park, and they occupy this park, and it begins the Occupy movement. We're broadcasting from Zuccotti. We were talking about it before it happened. The networks were almost silent on Occupy for the first week. It was astounding. We were in the media metropolis of the world, and the network anchors are walking by this area, right? It's right in the middle of Wall Street, and yet they are not giving it credence until they can no longer remain silent. And the shows on the corporate networks like CNN that were saying, we give voice to the people. I remember one reporter was just going on the air with her first show that day, and she had a segment called Seriously. Well, Occupy was quite serious. And if anyone doubted in the United States, coordinated police attacks on encampments all over the United States, but the Occupy movement changed the language of equality in the United States and around the world. Everyone now knows, if you say 99%, what it means. That is truly astounding. If you say 1%, what does that mean? When you change the language, I think that shows, we don't know what effect it will continue to have and what kind of shape these movements will take, but it is deeply rooted right now in the United States and all over the world. That's the power of Occupy, is when it occupied the language.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, and thank you for your wonderful work. My name is Peter Ivanek, and I am a member of a direct democratic party called Direktdemokraterna, who's been in the first ever direct democratic party to enter a local parliament in the world, as far as I know. I lived in America for 8 years and studied, and I was there when 9/11 happened, and I was surprised that there were so few people asking the question why instead of who in America, and maybe here too. I wasn't here at the time. Which brings me to Sweden. There are a lot of think tanks in Sweden as well, who write in media, and we don't really know who they are. You have to look them up to find out who they really are. And the situation in Sweden is obviously not as bad as in America. just one example. When the state minister is asked, what are you going to do about unemployment? His answer is, we've created 250,000 new jobs, which isn't an answer to the question. And the journalists just let it go. And in my opinion, when journalists just let it go, they just become mouthpieces for the party propaganda. And obviously, politicians are politicians. They want to cover up their mistakes, and journalists have to support their families, obviously. So, and I read an article just a few days ago where it was reported that 700 journalists were losing their job in Sweden, and fewer journalists are keeping tabs on power. So, what are we supposed to do to get the truth in media and to get journalists to actually ask the tough questions?
Well,
Okay, I must say, I think there are many people who would like to ask questions. So
you want to
let's
couple
be
them, do a
brief
few?
on the questions, but I would like you to answer like in between.
Okay.
That's good.
You know, I think we have to challenge the corporate media, and we have to build our own media. But on the issue of asking questions, I think even here in Sweden, there are, as you point out, there are a lot of critical questions. One of the questions I've been asking coming here, a story that's very big right now in the United States, we just came from Germany, Berlin and Bonn, is the issue of surveillance and monitoring. And not only the NSA, which is extremely significant, much larger than the CIA, the National Security Agency, but you know, the revelations of Snowden are astounding. This 29-year-old at the time who made his way outside of the United States to release these documents, which he did to two journalists, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald in Hong Kong. He flies on to Russia because he's trying to get political asylum in Latin America, but the U.S. pulls his passport, so he ends up in Russia. In the United States, the questions were immediately, clearly, he's a Russian spy. But he didn't want to go to Russia. The U.S. government is saying, why did he go to Russia? The U.S. government knew full well why he ended up in Russia. They pulled his passport. He couldn't move from the Russian airport. And that's a case where you need media that's independent of the state. The state will say what they want. They said it was all lies. And what they do is they provoke, they sort of force the situation, because if he didn't have the documents, if he just said, trust me, I was a national security, I saw that I could read the email of President Obama, trust me, because he had the documents, and now they have revealed them one by one in newspapers and on networks all over the world, they cannot deny it. The most President Obama could do was say, we would have had this debate anyway. Really? Really? They denied it until the last possible minute. You had the head of national intelligence, James Clapper, lying to congressional committee when they said it was a Senate committee, Ron Wyden, one of the leading senators in the United States on the issue of intelligence, saying, are you spying on Americans? And he said, no. And then he had to admit it wasn't quite true. So that's one story, the story of Edward Snowden, these revelations and what it means. In Germany, we're also asking about the German intelligence agencies working with the NSA and spying on Germans. Of course, the U.S. themselves, the U.S. government spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone, not to mention Germans. But how did he make his way? How did he end up not in a U.S. jail right away, Edward Snowden? Well, he made his way to Russia and then got political asylum. What will happen next, we will see. But it was WikiLeaks that helped him make that transition, which is pretty astounding because, you know, we're talking about Julian Assange, who was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, who is wanted by the U.S. government for WikiLeaks, for 2 years, just past the second anniversary. He is concerned if he steps outside the embassy, he would be arrested by British authorities and extradited here to Sweden on charges of on sexual misconduct allegations. But the question I am asking, that I asked Carl Bildt yesterday, that I asked the head of the Left Party today on Democracy Now!, is the issue of this pre-charge detention. What happens here? This is a period where most people in the U.S. think that he has been indicted. That doesn't mean convicted, but that means indicted. is going to be extradited to Sweden for a trial. But the fact is, he has not been even indicted. It's pre-charge, and that's very unusual that he has dealt with this for 4 years pre-charge. Now, what Julian Assange said, and I have interviewed him repeatedly, is that he is willing to answer the questions of Swedish authorities, but he's holed up in the embassy, and so he has asked them to come to question him there. I mean, they've come in other countries to question murderers. Why not come to question him there? And it's a very serious question, how he can end up in this situation. Now, if he came here, he says he's willing even to come here, but what he's concerned is he's been told he'll immediately be jailed. And then, once he deals with this, which he is willing to do, these not charges, but allegations, that he could then immediately be sent to the United States. And we know what that means. Edward Snowden knows what that means. I mean, that shows Edward Snowden's bravery, right? He was doing this in the midst of the Chelsea Manning trial. This young intelligence officer who went to Iraq and was convicted of releasing documents to WikiLeaks, gets 35 years in prison. So Snowden knows what that means. Julian Assange knows what that means. So he has said he's willing to deal with Sweden on the allegations, not even the charges. What he's concerned about is what the U.S. is concerned about, and the fact that there's a secret grand jury panel here in the United States that he doesn't even know if there's a secret indictment around holding him, charging him for releasing U.S. documents. And this is one of the questions I'm asking while I'm in Sweden, because I think all these stories are connected, and it's important to have an independent press in Sweden that also asks these questions.
Brian Palmer, Uppsala University. Amy, I share your admiration for the Almedalen Political Week, as we talked about yesterday on the show. I want to ask, are there any aspects of Swedish activist life that you find disturbing or problematic, or any areas where you feel that Swedish activists could be learning something from American or other countries' activists?
Maybe I should put that question back to all of you, because you may know more than I do about the activism of Swedes on different issues. Almedalen is amazing for this sort of confluence of this gathering of all the different parties. What's critical, though, is that there's real debate and discussion. It's hard for me to know exactly because I don't speak Swedish. But what the spectrum of opinion is. I mean, yesterday on Democracy Now!, I interviewed Carl Bildt, the foreign minister. I interviewed Martin, how do you pronounce his last name? Smedjebak, a young activist who's been in prison 3 times for hammering on the warheads of Swedish weapons going into plants. In the United States, we have that movement, and we cover it extensively, called Plowshares, where nuns and priests do this, throw their blood on warheads. And I think what most people don't know outside of Sweden, or don't realize, you know, here we are at the birthplace of Alfred Nobel, the founder of the Nobel Peace Prize, but that Sweden has is one of the largest exporters of weapons in the world. And I asked the head of the Left Party about that today and the kind of positions that are being taken. But to hear the voices of people who do put their bodies on the line. In 2008, when we were here in Sweden, in Stockholm, we did 2 broadcasts. And we covered the Nobel Peace Prize, and we covered the protesters. At the time it was at Bofor's plant, who were putting their bodies on the line there. And at the end of the hour, when everyone had left, all the guests, and we were packing up our gear, I turned to the cameramen, you know, the guys at the commercial TV studio in Stockholm who do this stuff forever. And he was coming out from behind the camera. I said, "What'd you think of the show?" I mean, I said, "I know this is business as usual for you. It's, you know, it's just a paid job. You know, they're just part of a commercial TV studio, and you must see this stuff all the time." He said, "No, I did not see this stuff all the time." So I said, "Well, how long have you worked here?" He said, "Oh, 20 years." So I said, "So why was this hour so different?" And he said, "We do not have these people in our TV studios that you had." One of them was a young woman with dreads, you know. She was about to go to jail. She had protested the weapons plan. He said, "Like her." He said, "I've never seen one of them close up." And he said, "There I was looking through the lens at her." And he said, "And I don't disagree." And he said, "I don't agree with her at all." So I said, "So what'd you think?" And he said, "I understood her for the first time. I've seen those people. I've seen pictures of them. I finally understood why she did what she did. I don't agree with her, but I understood." And I think, I mean, when we were in London in a commercial TV studio, we invited in Tony Benn, who recently died. You know, the longest reigning member of Parliament of the Labour Party, Anthony Wedgwood Benn. He was ran the Stop the War movement. He was a leading voice in Britain, you know, not just by our assessment, but, you know, in Britain, he's a major figure. So one of the times we're in London, we invite him in the studio, commercial studio. They have everyone in there, and they're contracted by American networks and by British networks to just have people in, and they give a studio for them. So when he comes into the studio, I mean, the cable layers go up to him, "Mr. Benn, it's a great honor to meet you. It's a great honor to meet you." The head of the studio comes out, "It's a great honor. It's a great honor." Oh, my goodness. So we do our show. He leaves, and I said to them, "I'm confused. Do you really greet all of your guests like this?" Because, I mean, he's such a big figure. I figure he's in there all the time. And they said, "Not at all, but that was Mr. Benn." So I said, "But doesn't he come in often?" They said, "He's almost never invited in here." And these studios are contracted by all of the networks in Britain and all over the world. I said, "Really?" He said, "Really. And we thank you." We were able to thank him. And these were people across the political spectrum, often much more conservative in these commercial studios. And that just goes to show that the conservative-liberal divide, I think when we come down to it and we really talk to people, I think it's melting away.
One last question then for you.
Thank you. My name is Jane Carlson. I work for an aid organization called the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan. And I got to thinking of, we had a seminar just earlier that talked about the Swedish journalist who got killed in Afghanistan just a couple of months ago, Nils Horner. And the direct consequence of him being killed is that the Swedish public get to hear fewer voices from Afghanistan right now. And I'm just thinking, in Kabul, he was a radio journalist. And my question to you is, do you see a trend where journalists are targeted in the conflicts in the world by the, maybe not by the states, but by the resistant groups, rather? And what does that mean in that case?
I just want to say that journalists are at risk all over the world. And it's extremely important to deal with this issue. Not because journalists are some special class of people, but a threat to freedom of the press is a threat to the public's right to know. And that knowledge of what's taking place is the oxygen of a democracy. I am very sorry about this case of this reporter in Afghanistan. In Egypt right now, you know, there are 3 Al Jazeera reporters, Bahar Mohammed, Mohammed Fahmy, and Peter Gresta, who have been sentenced in the last weeks to 7 to 10 years in prison. These are established reporters who work with all the networks. They happen to be working with Al Jazeera right now. And a bunch of other Al Jazeera reporters were sentenced in absentia, so they can't not only go to Egypt, but even in any country that might have a relationship with Egypt. I think of Samuel Haj, who also happens to have been an Al Jazeera reporter. We recently went to Doha and interviewed him. You know, in Doha at Al Jazeera, he's one of hundreds of reporters, no big deal. But he happened to have been targeted, sadly, by the United States, and he ended up at Guantanamo for more than 6. No charges against him. He was questioned more than 100 times. His interrogations, what were they about? What are the thoughts of the leaders of Al Jazeera? Now think about that. In Sweden, I don't even know necessarily in the United States the heads of news networks, but if I was questioned about the views of the heads of a particular network, who even knows? And he's being interrogated and tortured over this. I think of Tarek Ayoub, who is a young Al Jazeera reporter in Iraq. He had just come over the border in Jordan. It was April 8th, 2003, the day before the U.S. took Baghdad. And he was on the roof of the Al Jazeera studios setting the camera, and he was just making his way down. First, it was Abu Dhabi TV across the street that was getting shelled by the U.S. military. Then he was strafed and killed. His wife, Dima Taboub, at his funeral said, "Hate breeds hate. Who's engaged in terrorism now?" The reporters all over the world who get targeted, it's a violation for all publics, all citizens of all countries, because it means, as you know from this reporter in Afghanistan, you get less access to the information. And why does that matter? Seeing the images, hearing people speak for themselves, it is transformative. And it enables people in every country to decide what their government should do. I was recently speaking in Chicago just a few days ago, in Chicago in the United States. And I was telling the story of this boy in Chicago in the 1950s he's a well-known figure in the United States because of what happened to him. He was 14 years old. His name was Emmett Till. He was an African-American kid. And his mother, Mamie Till, wanted him to get out of the city for the summer, so she sent him to Mississippi. This is in the summer of 1955. And he ended up being lynched by a white mob. They ripped him out of bed at his aunt and uncle's house. And he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and he was sent back to Chicago, his body, his mother, Mamie Till, said, "I want the casket open for the wake and the funeral. I want the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry." Thousands of people passed by his casket and saw. And then Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended head, and they were actually published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of the people of the United States. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. I always say to people, American audiences, could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? Every day, when your country is at war, it should be the top story all the time. It's the most serious decision a country could make. If we saw the top of every newspaper, the front page, a picture of a baby dead on the ground, and we knew her name and her story. If the top of every radio and TV newscast, we saw a soldier dead and dying. If everyone tweeted and emailed, and everyone's Facebook wall, there was a story of a woman whose legs were blown off by maybe a drone strike, and we knew the circumstances. For just 1 week, I think not only Americans, but people are all over the world are compassionate. And they would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century.
Thank you, Amy. I think this was a very good message to end this seminar with. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you spread the word about Democracy Now. You let people know to tune in, democracynow.org, or on your open channels. It's the way we get word out. And, we started on 8 stations. We're now on 1,200 stations. And it's a way for us all to